real. It's actually questions of what we were mentioning before of specification. And as Joseph mentioned, Qurtubi sort of said a lot of us people in the later generations, we understand this whole question of abrogation in a way that's much more simple-minded than the way that they used to understand it in earlier generations. They were talking about specification and conditioning and so forth and so on, whereas we are just talking about wiping away what came before by what came after. That's not always legitimate. Now, some say that hadith I quoted earlier, you know, the one, I have been commanded to fight people until they, you know, so forth and so on, points to the fact that even though in the beginning Muslims were commanded to spread the truth of Islam peacefully and not to be aggressive and, you know, there was no coercion in religion and so forth, that this hadith points to the fact that at a certain point this general guideline was abrogated. And from that point forward, Muslims were commanded to fight non-Muslims until they accepted Islam, and that was a legitimate legitimate use of force, a legitimate reason to apply the use of force, I should say. But that is a minority position. The majority of the scholars of Quranic exegesis hold that the command to preach peacefully and never to coerce a person in his choice of religion was never abrogated and continued to hold sway through the end of the Prophet's life and beyond. But amongst this position, this majoritarian position that one could not coerce another person into his religion, there were basically two positions. Some said that the people referred to in this hadith of the Prophet were the Arabian idol worshippers, while all others, people of the book, Zoroastrians, Jews, Christians, they belong in the second category. For example, the Qur'an talks about, quoting, God does not forbid you with regard to those who do not fight you on account of religion and did not expel you from your homes, from being kind and just with them. Truly God loves the just. That's one example of a verse. A second group of scholars holds that the command enshrined in the verse, there is no coercion in religion, la ikraha fi din, is universal and applies to everyone, whether they are idol worshippers or Jews or Christians, regardless. In any case, in both cases, it's the majority position is that the scope of I have been commanded to fight the people is limited to those whom the Prophet was engaged in conflict at that time. That is to say, it was a very specific historical case. And the majority of scholars don't think that the people refers to, you know, everybody everywhere. It's not a kind of a universalist injunction. And I wish I could spend actually a little bit more time talking about this idea of hadith, that is to say, sayings of the Prophet, overturning the Qur'an or certain verses from the Qur'an, especially in the case of the use of force and in cases of war. Because if that hadith that says, I have been commanded to fight the people, whatever that means, that could mean the local population, could mean all mankind, is quite ambiguous. It would have to overturn literally hundreds of Quranic verses in order to mean what it means. Not just one or two. It's not like wine drinking, which, you know, is 2 or 3 verses in the Quran pertaining to it. This is literally hundreds, and that's problematic. Really? I thought I had 30
So is that. That's very problematic.
Oh, was it 30 minutes? All right. I'll try and make my way through quickly. You know what I'll do is I'll skip through this section about the conduct of war, because that's somewhat usually standard, this idea of how does one conduct oneself in war, the killing of innocents and belligerents and so forth and so on. That has a lot to do with just specific parts of the Sharia. We can talk about that afterwards. But just quickly to go through this idea of dhimmis, the use of force against non-Muslim populations. The dhimmi has now become like vernacular in America, you know. It's like now you have like bloggers saying, oh, you Jews and Christians accept your dhimmitude, you know, ironically saying like these Muslims want to make dhimmis out of you, and you know, whatever that's supposed to mean. Without going into too much detail, I mean, the idea of dhimmi in the Qur'an, there's basically two kinds of dhimmis. You have, you know, this kind of protected peoples who, you know, they get incorporated into the Islamic State either as a separate political entity where they run their affairs. This was like the case, for example, with the Christians of Najran. They paid a kind of a tribute to the Islamic Empire, but then beyond that, there was really no interference from the Islamic Empire. And the other kind of protected peoples are those who, let's say, for example, living in the middle of Baghdad, like Jews and Christians living in Baghdad or living in Istanbul, where they actually share territory. And that was another kind of status of the dhimmis. The idea of this kind of idea of second-class citizens and being robbed of their rights and so forth and so on. I mean, one could say a lot of things about that, but what's interesting from the point of view of the law is that it's easy to focus on the maximum rights that are placed on these kind of protected peoples. Oh, they can't do more than X, Y, and Z. But what's really revolutionary from the point of view of Islamic law is that it provided a minimum. That is to say, there was a minimum set of rights that these Jews and Christians and people of the book get. It established a bound that you couldn't, I mean, there was no option for just liquidating the Jews and the Christians because they were Jews and Christians. I mean, this was completely unallowable from the point of view of Islamic law. You can quibble and say, well, why weren't they given full rights that Muslims had? But that's a complex question. But what's interesting is that it provides both a maximum and a minimum. And that's often the case in matters of law. We have to look at both those things. For example, there was a maximum of rights given to women in the Qur'an, some would say, but what was revolutionary was the minimum of rights that were given to women in the Qur'an, if you think about the context of the time. Let me not talk about the jizya and these kinds of things. They're kind of technical questions about the poll tax and so forth and so on. And I'll just kind of skip to what I think is maybe the most interesting, one of the more interesting questions in the time that I have, which is, you can say, well, the Muslims community, they were thrown out of their homes, they were oppressed, they were killed, they had to flee to Abyssinia and to Medina and so forth and so on. So of course, who couldn't agree that they would be allowed to use force to go back to Mecca, for example? It would be kind of uncontroversial. But then you have to ask, well, all right, but what about everything that came after that? Why did the Muslim community have the moral right to expand into the rest of Arabia? Why did Omar ibn al-Khattab have the right to conquer Jerusalem, for example? I think there's an answer to that question, but it's a question that deserves to be asked. I think one answer is to say that well, first of all, it wasn't to convert the population, as I mentioned before. I mean, because the first mayor or governor of Jerusalem was Jewish, and many of the converted populations remained Christian. Many of the conquered populations, I should say, remained in their own religion for a long, long time, and there was there wasn't really any examples of forced conversion in the early period. But at the same time, it wasn't like a naked, kind of brutal, aggressive war of conquest. I mean, men like Abu Bakr and Omar they weren't really interested in the spoils of war. I mean, Omar was, for example, extremely ambivalent about the conquest. I mean, when he heard reports of all the riches coming back, he was like, oh, this is terrible. This is going to corrupt the souls of the Muslim armies to become rich. And I think one way of understanding some of these conquests, the use of force. I mean, you're conquering. You're taking out your sword and you're charging into Jerusalem and into the Sasanian Empire and into the Byzantines. What justifies this? My personal reading of this and my personal understanding is that what the early community was doing, they viewed it as it were trying to create a minimum political, cultural, social entity that would protect and preserve Islam, for the long term. Which is to say, they had a sense that if they were just to sort of hang out and not do anything and just be passive, Islam would have probably been eroded and wiped out by the powers that existed around them in Arabia at the time. So I think there was a sense that one needed to take this spiritual core, this set of beliefs, this spiritual entity, and build for it, as it were, a kind of a city that would allow it to live and thrive in the long term. And I want to read just a quote that I think enshrines this sensibility that existed amongst many companions in the earlier generations who sort of exhibited a sensibility of what they were fighting for. Abdullah ibn Omar, during one of the civil wars that followed the death of the Prophet, was kind of on the sidelines, as many of the companions were, actually. They didn't want to have anything to do with the infighting between the companions and so forth. And he was approached by people, and they said, why aren't you fighting? Like, why aren't you out there with a sword in your hand? And he replied to the people who asked him this question. He said, son of my brother, Islam is built upon 5 things: belief in God, His Messenger, the 5 prayers, the fast of Ramadan, giving zakah, and making the Hajj. And then they quoted verses at him, trying to convince him of the error of his ways, that no, you should fight, and so forth. And after the quotation of those verses, he replied back to them. He said, we did that in the time of the Prophet, when Islam was a trifling little thing, and when a man could be tried in his religion, and when they could either kill him or torture him to become a non-Muslim. But then Islam became great, and there was no more trial, and hence no more need to exert force in order to protect it. that to me really captures a very important point, which is to say there was a consciousness that if you're going to fight, it has to be for the sake of establishing and protecting this thing that we call Islam. It shouldn't be for the sake of naked conquest. And I think that reflects the conduct and the way in which, at least the very earliest conquests, I don't want to say anything about all the ensuing centuries, but the very first ones, I think were guided not by conversion, not by a desire for power, but there was a conscious idea amongst them that there was this revelation, there was this message from God that needed to be protected, and that's what justified it. It's amazing that you don't really find these kinds of justifications when you read the traditional sources. It's basically saying, like, we're Muslims, this is the truth, Muslims have a right to conquer these other people, full stop. I mean, the idea of asking a question, what right did Omar have to conquer Jerusalem? I mean, no, these are not questions that are asked. The answer is assumed, and I think it's fruitful to kind of ask those kinds of questions in order to get at the moral pith of it. But I'll just stop there and maybe leave it open for questions.
This is a question, Professor Dagli. In thinking what a modern tafsir might help us with in the question of the use of violence.
The use of what?
The use of violence, where it's appropriate, where it's not appropriate. You went through the things about forced conversion or believing where you think it really isn't a forced conversion. But I guess the question that I'm really thinking of is the definition of what polity we're sort of talking about then. If most of just war theory, which you're obviously referring to indirectly in your talk, is really primarily based on a post-Westphalian way of thinking about nation states and the protectors of borders in that particular way, and the challenges that we're now facing have to do with non-state actors and different types of, again, thinking, the challenge almost to nation states. How would we go to the Qur'an to think about these kinds of questions then? What polity would we be protecting even? I mean, Osama bin Laden presumes to talk for the Ummah, but what are we protecting then if we're even thinking about just war theory in this day and age, based on the Qur'an?
Right. Well, that's a very interesting way of looking at the question. I mean, it's true that most of the world we were born into, and when we think about international relations and violence of states on states, is exactly what you said. It's nation states acting on each other. And the Kellogg-Briand Pact, the UN Charter, the Nuremberg Principles, Geneva Conventions, all pertain almost entirely to nation state actors. And I think, at least when it comes to the earlier, the pre-modern political entities, I think you could make the analogy. I mean, I think they're similar enough. I mean, you're talking either about presidents and prime ministers, and you can talk about emperors and kings and so forth. In terms of tackling the question on what about non-state actors, what about individual Muslims and so forth, well, I think the first stop is what I kind of skipped over in my paper, which is to say that the Islamic tradition provides a lot of guidance in terms of the conduct of war, not just the justifications for war, but then the conduct within war. The idea of not killing women and children, non-combatants, not cutting down trees unnecessarily, and a lot of those kinds of laws which pertain to everybody. I mean, those can be taken with universal import. But at a higher level, I think it can't only be a technical legal answer. In other words, it can't, that's what Muslims tend to do. I mean, when they come up with these kinds of questions, they start reaching into the tradition and start talking about Dar al-Islam and Dar al-Ahad and Dar al-Sulh and Dar al-Harb and trying to go and finding these technical legal answers. And we have to do that, but there's also a way in which they need to kind of try and penetrate the moral justifications for why people are, doing what they're doing. And, if a person, my point towards the end of the paper is that there needs to be a constantly articulated consciousness of why we exert force. It can't just be a mechanical legal thing, they're the disbelievers, we're the Muslims, we want this territory, and it's kind of justified by the law without getting into the morality of it, without getting into what the law says about the ethics of doing something. And if you just try and tackle it from saying what does the Sharia say about individual violence, it's not going to go that far, because yeah, anybody can go into the, like, which is what bin Laden does. He cherry picks things and he kind of comes up with things, and that's what he comes up with. Actually, what he says about foreign policy is correct, and what he says about Islam is ludicrous, you know, in terms of what he thinks is justified morally and ethically and so forth and so on. So I think the answer lies in kind of attacking these legal questions ethically and trying to get into what, for Dr. Crane, for example, mentioned Maqasid al-Sharia, really trying to have these things be articulated, and ask questions like, what business do Muslims have conquering territory? What business do Muslims have, you know, exerting force in this or that manner? And I don't think it needs to be, I wasn't trying to just restrict the conversation to states. Well, I mean, just to quickly follow up, I mean, that's what I mean, like, when you can't just do it as a technical question of the law. I mean, the ethical, you know, the Maqasid al-Sharia, you have to, we don't do, which we haven't done. I mean, there's no such thing in Islam as a well-developed kind of philosophical ethics. We keep our ethics in different places. There's no well-articulated kind of philosophical ethics of the law. I mean, that's too absolute a statement, but it's relatively inarticulate in comparison to other parts of the Islamic tradition. And that's a place where that needs to be brought out more explicitly. It's there, but it needs to be brought out more explicitly, and that has to be part of the solution. It can't just be technical, because you'll dig into some legal work, and then he'll dig into some legal work, and it'll just be this duel of technical concepts, which don't ever get anywhere. The question, just for the sake, I guess, of the record, is about what is the role, and if any, that the Qur'an and other early commandments from the Prophet and the companions might have played in, let's say, the formation of the UN Charter and the Geneva Conventions. I mean, I'm not an expert in the history of international relations, but I would hazard a guess to say little to none. I mean, this was actually something that I was thinking about and I wrote about in the longer version of the paper, which is that you do have a lot of commonalities between the basic principles that you find in the UN Charter of non-aggression and in the Geneva Conventions in terms of the conduct of war, and what happened in Islamic law. But the real impetus, if I'm reading the history correctly, between, you know, for these new international agreements were the horrors of the world wars early, you know, in the first part of the century.